Todo ha subido.
Everything has gone up.
DoorDash driver Maria Hernandez says a new Seattle law is urgently needed to guarantee higher pay for gig workers.
They don't have access to many of the really important labor protections.
But the so-called pay up proposal is facing pushback as it tries to set a minimum wage after expenses for drivers and other app-based workers.
Will there be an impact? I think the answer is most certainly yes.
We get two opposing views.
We think the policy we have now is the policy that's ready to go and the policy that should be adopted in Seattle.
I think there's technical problems with this and we should study it a little bit further.
Driving the conversation towards some answers next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Seattle could soon become the first city in the U.S. to establish a minimum wage for all of its app-based workers. The City Council, which approved a minimum wage for Uber and Lyft drivers 2 years ago, says people who work for DoorDash or Care.com should be guaranteed better pay as well. The so-called Pay Up bill is welcomed by workers' rights groups, but it's facing pushback from the app platforms, some drivers, and some City Council members too. It's taken about a year for the council to develop this complex gig worker legislation. But as the current arguments over pay up show, there are still plenty of battles ahead. When Maria Hernandez started working for DoorDash in 2019, the wages were good and the work was steady.
Me gustó.
I liked it because it was they were offering $25 per hour.
And while this mother of two, like many gig workers during the pandemic, saw demand for her services increase, her bills increased too.
La comida,
The food,
la ropa,
clothing,
todo ha subido,
everything has gone up,
pero nuestro salario no ha subido.
but not our wages.
Consider this 9.2-mile trip from downtown Seattle to a restaurant in Ballard, then to a customer in North Seattle for a $9.59 payment. From drive time to paying for parking and gas, Maria says her hourly pay through the app can be well below Seattle's $17.27 minimum hourly wage for large employers.
Solamente pagan las millas
They only pay for mileage,
y si el cliente da
and
propina.
if the client gives a tip.
Si no, el pago es muy...
Otherwise, the payment is really low.
Thousands of workers have contributed to the development of the pay-up policies.
That's why Maria supports Pay Up, new legislation from the Seattle City Council that would guarantee gig workers minimum wage plus expenses, transparency on how much a gig would actually pay, and flexibility to reject jobs without the penalties that some apps use to incentivize gig workers.
Tuve el accidente.
Maria, whose previous car was totaled in a crash on Aurora, is now making monthly payments on a used Kia and says Pay Up, which would offer a $5 minimum payment per gig, could provide a much-needed boost.
Yo en mi caso debo mi auto.
Pay up would help me in my case, especially because I still owe money for my car.
We support app-based workers being able to make a competitive wage.
That's Rachel Smith of the Seattle Metro Chamber of Commerce, who says she supports the goal of Pay Up, but not the path it's taking, especially when it comes to so-called marketplace apps.
So if in your mind you're thinking this is just going to impact the person getting their sandwich delivered downtown, that's not the case.
The City Council began crafting Pay Up last year with a focus on delivery apps, but policies for marketplace network apps like Care.com or TaskRabbit were added to the legislation just a few weeks before the Council's committee meetings on Pay Up in April.
These companies are not all the same. There's not real clear definitions about the market-based apps versus the delivery network companies.
Plus, Smith says, higher costs for the app companies could affect how much customers will pay and how much gig workers will work.
Will there be an impact? I think the answer is most certainly yes.
Considering those impacts and the work the city's Office of Labor Standards will need to do just to implement Pay Up for multiple platforms, Smith is hoping for a pause in the push for this legislation.
We know there's a lot of questions from stakeholders, and we think it's important to get those questions answered so that we get this policy right.
That lack of urgency doesn't sit well with someone who delivered food during a pandemic.
Tuve que usar pañales.
I had to wear diapers
Porque todos
Because
los baños estaban cerrados.
all the bathrooms were closed.
So buckle up. Seattle is taking a journey to become the first U.S. city to establish a minimum wage for app workers. And it may not be a smooth ride. So what are city council members saying about pay up? They're not all on the same page. Here's my conversation with the bill co-sponsor, Lisa Herbold, chair of the Public Safety and Human Services Committee. To begin, I want to get the story behind pay up. Why did you introduce this legislation? What are you trying to accomplish here?
Sure. Most people don't realize that app-based workers are considered independent contractors, which means they're not considered employees, and they don't have access to many of the really important labor protections that we've worked so hard in Seattle to beef up for people who are legally considered employees. Improved minimum wage, paid sick and safe time, secure scheduling, and an Office of Labor Standards to enforce all those laws. So app-based workers don't have those same protections. And as we see the number of app-based employees increasing in our city across every single job sector, it's really important that that those workers get these protections.
And can you tell me what those protections are? Summarize them, please.
Sure. So this is going to be one of a number of different bills, but this bill that is before the council right now focuses on three issues: a minimum payment standard. So it's just a way of formulating the minimum payment in such a way that it ensures that people make at least minimum wage plus their expenses associated with doing the work. So that's one component of the ordinance. A second component is transparency, providing workers with the bare minimum information that they need to make informed choices about which offers to accept and to verify the compliance of the platforms who pay them for minimum pay requirements. And also providing customers with information on the nature of charges, including amounts to be paid to workers and amounts to be retained by the company. And then finally, the third element in this bill is to preserve flexibility. That is one of the benefits of this app-based work, is the flexibility that it allows workers. And so the legislation would work to protect the right to freely choose jobs and hours while also maintaining the company's provision of services to customers and third-party businesses like our small restaurants.
Because I know there's been some concerns about this from some of the app companies here. Councilmember Nelson was talking about this recently on Council Edition with me last month, as a matter of fact. She doesn't think pay-up is the right way to regulate marketplace apps like Rover or TaskRabbit. She's worried that if one framework is used for all these apps as well as the delivery services, it could cause some problems. Here's a brief clip of what she said.
I called it a single regulatory framework because it's one bill centered on one calculation to develop a minimum hourly or per delivery fee that is going to be about twice as much as minimum wage.
I guess just in looking at this, would you consider dropping these marketplace apps from this bill, maybe introducing separate legislation for them? Some thoughts about what Councilmember Nelson is saying here.
Sure. I think it's really important that we address the misconception that just because both types of work is regulated in a single bill, that means there's a single framework. That's not true. It is one bill, but there is two different regulatory approaches. And the regulatory approach for the marketplace apps is very different than the regulatory approach for the on-demand apps. So I think it's really important that we do a good job explaining that. And so there are a lot of inputs for the formula for minimum pay for the marketplace app that are just simply not included in that formula for marketplace apps that are included for the on-demand apps.
So the current proposal would add a new per minute and per mile reimbursement rate to what drivers would get paid, starting from the time they accept the gig, plus a new $5 fee for each order.
If you're looking at the on-demand apps, it's by design going to be higher than minimum wage because it's minimum wage plus your expenses necessary to do the job.
Got it. And let's look at this Office of Labor Standards piece, because I know that's another criticism brought up here. Councilmember Nelson's talked about this one too. This idea of we're going to have this Office of Labor Standards process, if indeed this legislation goes through here, this rulemaking process that they go through.
Another suggestion I would have is to pass the legislation, but delay its implementation until OLS can complete its rulemaking process.
Do you delay implementing pay up until that rulemaking is done, just to make sure this thing is working out okay, avoid any unintended consequences, as Councilmember Nelson was saying, or would the council vote again after OLS puts its rules through? Talk to me about this next part with OLS, please.
Well, because the rules are necessary for the implementation and enforcement, by the very nature of the construction of the legislation, the enforcement of pay up, the minimum standard does not go into place until after the rules are completed. So that is the very nature of rulemaking. You can't implement or enforce a law without the rules associated with the policy being in place and promulgated publicly in advance. That process in itself is a process that is layered on with the engagement of stakeholders, both workers and the folks who are the employers, and that will be a many months process as well.
This is a process with pay up that's been going on for some time. I wanted to, if I could, open the floor here a little bit and just talk about this whole situation in general with pay up, your expectations over the next couple months here, what you hope comes out of this. Again, this is a process that's taken many months for you to develop.
Since last summer, we've been working and having large format stakeholder meetings, and there's typically 30 to 40 folks who are participating, both representing the employees as well as all of the platforms, and everybody from DoorDash to Uber Eats to TaskRabbit to Rover to Instacart. And those meetings have been going on for almost a year now. We've had 12 of them, but we've also had periodic touch-ins with the council committee and sort of highlighting the progress that we're making as we have been going through this. And even before introducing legislation, we had I think at least 2 public meetings in my committee, in addition to the large stakeholder meetings. And so we've just heard for the first time a briefing on the introduced bill. And next will the central staff have identified some of the issues that people have had concerns about, areas that might be ripe for amendments in subsequent meetings, and that'll be the next step.
Thank you very much for joining me, Councilmember Lisa Herbold, talking to us about the pay up legislation. And joining us to continue this discussion, we have with us Danielle Alvarado. She is the Executive Director of Working Washington, which helped craft the pay up legislation, and also Michael Wolfe, Executive Director of Drive Forward Seattle, an advocacy group which says pay up isn't ready for prime time. So let's take it from here. Danielle, let me start with you. All the stakeholders in this discussion are saying gig workers should be paid fairly, but there are a lot of details to work through. I know you've heard the critics say Seattle should take some more time to do this right. How do you respond to that?
You know, we all know that gig working is an essential part of the economy. It's a part of economy that's booming, multi-billion-dollar corporations, and tens of thousands of workers in Seattle are doing work right now without any workplace protections. So we are operating in a crisis here in Seattle, and we need to have a solution. And we have an opportunity right now. We have a well-crafted solution that has gone through extensive stakeholdering, and we think this policy is ready and it's responsive to the priorities that workers have raised for us, having a minimum wage after expenses, maintaining flexibility, and adding transparency so that workers really have the information they need to make the choices about when they're accepting jobs on these platforms.
Okay, thank you for that. Michael, I'll go to you, and I want to talk about your top issues with pay up here. It sounds like you think this could hurt and not help gig workers like yourself.
Well, I think it has what I'll say is, first of all, we actually, as an organization of members who are drivers in all aspects of gig work, whether it's rideshare or delivery, we even have members who are working on the marketplace apps such as TaskRabbit and Rover. What we feel is that this proposal has some fairly technical problems. We agree with Working Washington that it's about time that drivers actually make at least minimum wage, that there's a pay floor set. We agree that drivers deserve to have some protections that are normally afforded to people who are W-2 employees. These are not things we disagree with them on. The disagreements come when the rubber meets the road and the mechanisms and how this legislation creates those protections and creates the minimum earning standard. So for us, the reason why we say this isn't ready for prime time is we feel the way this is structured is not only going to potentially significantly impact demand, which then could impact opportunities for drivers to earn. It also has the potential of creating an artificial cap on earnings, which is something we would like to avoid.
Okay, well, let's try to break this down, and maybe you can just respond to that, Danielle, this idea that this would somehow set a cap for drivers in terms of how much they could earn and might have a chilling effect on the market too in terms of demand for services like this.
So we don't see any reason why this would create a cap. We're talking about a floor, a minimum, so that people know when they do a job that they're going to get paid at least Seattle minimum wage. I think we can all agree it's common sense in 2022 that people not get paid for less than minimum wage for the work that they're doing. And I think that we think that the policy is well thought out in terms of how that will work. And we have seen time and time again, our organization is obviously very invested in this industry. We have advocated for other labor standards that we have here in Seattle. And we frequently hear industry and employers raise concerns that improving conditions for workers is going to decrease demand and overall make things worse for workers and customers. And we haven't seen that happen. It didn't happen when we raised the minimum wage in Seattle several years ago. It hasn't happened with other protections. In fact, what we see happens is that it improves the take-home pay for workers, which is better for the economy. It means they have more money to spend locally. It means that they can pay their rent, they can pay for their child health care. And so we think that especially see right now, this part of the economy has only continued to grow in the last few years. Demand is booming, and we see no reason why we can't both see this grow and also make sure that workers aren't left behind.
Got it. Michael, a response to that briefly before we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious in this particular sector. It's pretty price sensitive. There's a lot of inelasticity in this marketplace. And, we saw it when the city council passed their fair share ordinance, which was a similar plan for rideshare drivers. Right now, the city of Seattle demand in the city of Seattle for rideshare is almost 60% off its peak pre-pandemic. And you see in other cities, similar sized cities around this country, that demand is recovered to about only off about 15 to 20% of peak pre-pandemic. So there's something going on here. And the only difference between most of the other cities in America and Seattle is the new higher costs that consumers have to bear because of the higher minimum wage ordinance that we have. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't go down this road because, these issues. I'm saying there's what we propose to the city council, we feel is a solution that both makes sure drivers make at least minimum wage and also will have more flexibility for both the drivers and the companies to set pricing in a way that won't affect demand as badly.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. I did want to move on to another topic here if I could, because that demand issue is big, but also this issue with the marketplace network companies like TaskRabbit or Care.com. And Danielle, I want to start with you on this one, this whole idea of delivery work versus those other types of apps. So the policy around those marketplace apps was added to the pay-up legislation, as I understand it, a few weeks ago. Some critics are saying it's not a good fit. Would you support this idea of maybe separating out the marketplace apps as another part of this legislation?
No, so the way our labor standards work, every labor standard that we have in Seattle is that they're meant to cover the industries, right? They're meant to be as broad as possible to make sure that the conditions for workers are the same and that we don't have market incentives that drive down wages. And that's how our laws work, and they're effective for that reason. And so we think that it's important that the marketplace companies are included. Some of the same problems we see with the delivery apps, we also see with the marketplace apps. They have tremendous control over the access to work that workers have. They have incentives to pressure people to take certain jobs, either by lowering their ratings or directing them to jobs that are worth less. And so we think that we have some common problems right now, and we have the opportunity to have some common solutions. And the policy as it is developed right now does have some components that reflect, the differences in those business models and are able to accommodate it while also setting a floor that's going to make sure that all workers are covered.
Got it. Michael, some thoughts about this, because I think this marketplace app part is a part that's raised a lot of discussion.
Yeah, and it certainly has, and of course, what we look at is how the companies operate in terms of setting rates for what the workers get paid for the more on-demand apps, such as DoorDash or Uber Eats, or those kind of delivery, Instacart. They pretty much determine the rates that their workers are going to get paid. The companies set those rates, and that's it. There's not really much negotiating room for the drivers on those apps. However, when you look at web-enabled apps like TaskRabbit, Rover, and other things like Care.com or Angi, the people who are on those apps do have the opportunity to set their own rates. Now, should we allow those people to set rates below minimum wage? That's certainly a discussion we're very happy to have. And, but we just think that the mechanism by which you would want to regulate the marketplace apps is going to be a different mechanism than you would regulate the, on-demand apps. And so we would like to see, whether it's in the same legislation or a new piece of legislation, we would just like to see a better, more detailed framework for how you're going to deal with those marketplace apps.
Okay, thank you. I want to try to move on here because we need to start wrapping up here. I can give you a couple minutes, though, to do that. Danielle, I want to make sure I talk to you about this because we're speaking at a time when a lot of amendments are flying around the city council to reshape pay up. There's other parts of this legislation to come, like restroom access, anti-discrimination laws. I just want to talk to you. There's been a lot of feedback over the past few weeks with this. What modifications do you think need to be made with this first round of pay up? What should this bill on compensation, transparency, and flexibility look like?
So I think that it's important to remember that we've spent a year stakeholdering this process. Or this particular policy. So both of our organizations have engaged, the platforms have engaged, workers, most importantly, workers have been included in saying what they want this policy to look like. And so we think the policy we have now is the policy that's ready to go and the policy that should be adopted in Seattle. And we also know that it's important to move now because it's a crisis for workers. It's a pay crisis for the workers that are on these apps. And we know that these workers are disproportionately likely to be exactly the workers who have been excluded from workplace protections historically, workers of color, immigrant workers, disabled people, caregivers. And so we think it's ready, and we urge the city council to move quickly to make sure that we can adopt this first policy and move on to talking about all those other really important protections that you just mentioned.
Got it. Michael, some final thoughts from you. Stakeholdering, I know, is a piece of this, but also maybe some of the changes you'd like to see made to pay up just to try to make this legislation work better for you and your organization and maybe some other drivers out there.
I think what's important to note about the stakeholder process that happened is when, obviously we were part of it and it did go for more than a year. But most of the meetings, we were talking strictly about Working Washington's proposal. The proposal that we sent in, we spent half an hour, maybe 45 minutes talking about it versus hours and hours of time of Working Washington proposing their thing. It was very clear the city council wasn't particularly interested in hearing any other alternate proposals. So we're just a little, we just want to get a fair hearing here and be able to really talk about the differences in the proposals and come to a reasonable common sense conclusion as to which proposal is better. And so, we would just like to see the city council look at more data around this issue. There hasn't been any specific studies network marketplace companies. The only study that's been out there is the survey we did last year that did show that drivers, a good number of drivers, were making less than minimum wage. This is why we say we need this policy, but we need to make sure that what we're doing is the right policy. And right now, I think there's technical problems with this, and we should study it a little bit further. And so I hope the city council does do that and does take their time on this. I'm not saying we should take forever, but a little more time wouldn't be amiss.
All right. Thank you both for your input here, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about fairer pay for gig workers? One person writes, "Gig workers work hard for our communities. They deserve better." Another person says, "The gig economy offers workers flexibility. That usually comes with a trade-off of fewer benefits, but it's worth it for many." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, the city's dramatic growth over the last decade is going to have an impact on the 2023 elections. Find out how you can weigh in as Seattle's political boundaries are redrawn on the next City Inside Out. I hope you can join us.